So I want to ground you all a little bit in the two things. One, that if you were already here for the MEA conference, thank you for welcoming me back. It's amazing. I can't believe y'all like me like that. Secondly, a good afternoon class. It's been about 2 weeks since I've had class, so I'm like, wait a minute, I have a class in this. And then, of course, third, there are situations which we'll probably have to talk about, and as it turns out, I'm glad that I was invited here because my wife was super nervous about me coming here, and I said, if I'm afraid to go here, then what does that say about me trying to go anywhere else? So these are the conversations we need to have in mind as we proceed through this presentation. So you should know a little bit about me, since I am MTBOS, correct? Okay, come on. Is it clicking? Yes, no. Yes, no. Maybe this is one of those things. I graduated with a degree in computer science and I did nothing with it. Yay, look what I did. It pressed forward and it went forward. All right, so a little bit about me, I've been blogging now for the better part of a decade, actually a little bit more than that, and I did it under my own name for about that long. Before then, I was writing under a pseudonym, which I will not share with you because I cursed a lot out there. But it got better, and my writing got better, and eventually I became your keynote speaker for today. Something else worth noticing is that as I was blogging, I had a lot of people also responding because I was a math teacher. And so people wanted to find out who I was, what I was doing in New York City, why that all mattered. And at some point, there was a conversation about rap and music and teaching. And the people who were talking about it were talking about it on Twitter. And I was like, wait a minute, but I'm not on Twitter. How am I going to be able to talk to you all if I don't get Twitter? So I went ahead and got Twitter. And on Twitter, I became the JLB. And it's so funny. People say, well, do you have just like this really big ego that you have to put the before everything else? And the answer is no. I teach middle school. There is no ego. And for those of you who know, it's kind of like a parabola. So like you go first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All right, so I taught 7th grade my very first year, had 15 kids, and the first thing that they said to me was like, Mr. Vilson, you know this is not going to last forever, right? Of course not. And the very next day, I got an influx of about 25 kids. And they all had to learn. While I was teaching, mind you, they all lined up in the back and started getting registered into my class at the same time. So I had a lot of experience with Valley middle schoolers who were displaced immediately. So no ego there whatsoever. I think it's just a matter of how do we elevate ourselves to juxtapose ourselves against all the things that are going on in education and education reform. And the person, by the way, who was talking about me and rap, this guy, you've heard of him? Dan Meyer or something? He's kind of a big deal. Actually, just tallish, taller than me. So, one of the things I noticed about him was, he delved into the work really deeply, right? But then every so often he kind of go off script. So he talk about math, he talk about rap, hip hop, etc. And I was like, okay, well, why would you all want me to talk about rap? Like, what does that have to do with anything that I do? Is it because like I'm a rap guy or something? Not quite sure. Well, some of you got the Eminem reference. If you didn't, that's fine too. But the thing about Dan too is, and this is something interesting, is he exemplifies MTBOS in a very big way for me in that he steeps himself in the work so deeply that he was just, it was almost like very, very focused on what he was doing. When he did that big TED talk that everybody's seen like 100 billion times, I was there in the audience, and I'm not sure if you've been on his website, but he does mention that shortly thereafter, I came up to him and I said, this is going to be a big effing deal. Oh, wait, your video is a big deal. And he's like, no, absolutely not. I mean, this is whatever, it's not a big deal. And I said, no, this is going to go viral, like it's going to go wild. And sure enough, it did. So I was happy to be part of that success with him. I mean, he can speak for himself, right? I mean, he has a cartoon based on it. It's cool. But here's something else too, and I think I want to kind of tap into everyone's thought process here, right? When we think about people like that, people like yourself, there's always a subject of relevance and whether or not, the things that we do are relevant. Mr. Vilson, why do I care about what you're doing right now? Which is out of conversations that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years because of the way that I teach now. But of course, it's always a question when they get frustrated. Mr. Vilson, I'm not going to use this ever in life. You never have this conversation in ELA. Never in English, right? They could be reading To Kill a Mockingbird, they could be reading Pride and Prejudice, they could be reading like old Sanskrit out of like way back, and it's still relevant. Excuse me. Next one, social studies. It's always relevant. Social studies is always relevant, and we always look at I guess all these different types of governments and structures of government, and no one really asks, like, when am I ever really going to use this in life? Same with science, interestingly enough, because there's a lot of touching and feeling and trying to figure out how to look through different complex machines, and science is always relevant, always relevant. Gym and physical education, there's always some relevance, even when the kids are just playing basketball. For whatever reason, no one ever asked, Mrs. Vilson, is gym going to be relevant for me in my real life? That's curious to me. And this is where some of my theory comes from, because lunch is really relevant to kids. In their daily lives, they feel like lunch is so critical, right? But even the arts, yes, the art's great. Like, you're going to want to paint, you're going to want to sing, and I'm very happy for you. Some of you are. Who's a shower student here? I know some of y'all are a lot. Very relevant to your lives, I'm sure. And yet, something about what we're doing is not quite as relevant. And I'm trying to figure out why that is. Like, people are like, well, is this really going to be relevant for me? And why is that? Oh, look, I can talk and multitasking at the same time. I'm teaching still. Who gets to decide what's relevant? Why does it matter? The question I always pose back to students who ask that is, well, in ELA, do you just read DVD manuals? Do you just read instructions for your apps? Do any of you read the terms of agreement when you sign on to apps? No, absolutely not, right? Is your favorite author going to teach you how to do these things? Not necessarily, right? But you never ask that of them. Why are you asking that of me? Oh, I don't know Mrs. Wilson. Okay, so then there you go. What can I tell you? Math is math. We should just love math for doing math. Much the way that we love reading for doing reading. And yet, for some reason, we always have these little hucksters, these people who have no idea what they're doing, telling us what to do with our math. They're always coming into our conversation. Folks like Andrew Hacker, Nicholson Baker, who, by the way, I got into a little bit of tip. Let me get into that just now. Is this idea that you can be from the outside world, from somewhere, wherever, right, and just tell math teachers what they need to be teaching. How does that say about what we've allowed? And specifically, who asked them? Like, who are these people? I'm always curious. Political scientists and all these other folks get to come in and tell math teachers, oh, you're a terrible math teacher, and it starts with all you Algebra 2 folks. You're horrible. How can you teach variables the way you're doing it? You're so awful. Your college and career readiness. Look at you trying to be exciting in math. How dare you? And we're like, we're just trying to do our jobs, and we like kids, so this is what we're doing, and we're very passionate about what we do. And yet, and still, I'm curious how some of this may have been brought by us ourselves. I'm curious about how this is going to be our fault, and I'm going to try to get all of you to push yourselves a little bit in terms of expanding the boundaries of what it means to be MTBOS, what it means to be TMC, what it means to be a math teacher in this day and age. And one of the things that I noticed during my own journey was that there were two roads. There were two really big roads. There was, I could have just stripped math. I could have stuck to math, and that would have been totally fine. And everything is paved well. Right? Like, we already have people who've already done the math work, and they've all loved doing math, and they stuck to math and nothing else. Maybe every so often they'll talk about their favorite sports team. They'll talk about maybe Game of Thrones every so often, because Game of Thrones is kind of a big deal. I've never seen it, but I'm sure y'all have. But strictly math is a really easy way to approach the things that we do. Very easy. Because all you have to do is follow the model that's already been set out for you. And then, at some point, I said, I can't do that. I have to follow my own passions. I have to follow the things that I believe in. And some of that, I had to experiment, right? I had to get into some of the jokes that I saw. I had to get into some of the more, I guess, the seedier sides of what we call Twitter. And I started finding a lot of things about the ways that we approach our own teaching has a lot to do with what's actually on Twitter. So here's the things I found out, and I'd like y'all to know this because it's worth your time, I believe. The general public watches too many movies. The first thing they tell me when I tell them I am an 8th grade teacher of students math, right? I tell them that, and they're like, oh man, I don't know how you do it. I can't believe you. Like, you must deal with all the thugs and the criminals and all the gangsters. And I'm like, I mean, they're alright, but they're not all the way about that life. They can't really handle it. At least people think they are, right? But of course, they watch all these movies, Freedom Riders, etc., where they gotta step out lines and talk about how sensitive they are inside. Look at these black boys and girls, behaving all of a sudden at the end of the movie. It's all awesome. And that's not the way that works. The one conclusion I have found in my 11 years of teaching is, that the one thing I've learned is that at the end of that last day, they get a report card, and that's the only certainty you have. And even then, maybe not, right? And that's the only thing you have. I mean, what is this certainty about? But of course, everything has to be put in the movie. And teachers aren't supposed to be complicated based on these movies. Teachers aren't supposed to have feelings at all. We're supposed to be either patron saints or evil, like straight up evil. We're not supposed to be like somewhere complicated. We're like, yes, we have serious issues in our own personal lives, but when we get in the classroom, it's our sanctuary. How many of you feel like that? You're not in a movie. I'm sorry. How many of you are lying right now? And that's okay too. Because trust me, I mean, it's okay. They're only fooling me, not y'all. And that's okay. If you get drunk, like, it's cool. Come on, stop. I'll see y'all later on tonight. So, the general public, by the way, when you survey them, they think generally we do a very good job of what we do. We still have a approval rating that's higher than our presidential candidates combined. No, just real talk. Maybe not for everybody else, yes. So, the general public thinks we do a good job, except for like 1 or 2 bad apples. But the whole metaphor is, 1 or 2 bad apples spoils the bunch. So every time they see the bad teacher, like they always think psychologically, oh my gosh, that means that all the teachers are bad, because by association, they are all bad, even if they're good. Even if they're great, they're still bad because they didn't tell on that one teacher who was really, really bad. And that's not the way that works either. But that's complicated. But we're not given that freedom to be complicated like that. And the general public have a hard time with educators who talk about things other than teaching. I don't know if y'all noticed this, but whenever you turn on the TV and you look for education topics, right? Who do you see on TV talking about us? Not the teachers. Anybody else, right? Anybody but us teachers. As a matter of fact, there was a study done by, I think it was Media Matters for America, where it's less than 1% of the time that people who talk about education aren't actually educators. And they actually included like professors too. So the time the Diane Ravitch actually shows up on TV, that counted for us. So what are we to do as educators who can't actually talk about our professor, right? And in that sense, I kind of wonder if you're a college professor, by the way, raise your hand, because I don't want to discriminate against y'all. Like, y'all cool, don't get me wrong. It's cool if you're on TV, please do that. But then for the rest of us, we're kind of like, well, we can't even talk about our own jobs where we're at. So that leaves us in a really big bind. So why did I choose race? Well, I mean, look at me. And then look at y'all. Then look at me again. All right? Yes, it's okay to look at me. I'm handsome. It's hard. Right? Y'all gotta let that go. But the other part of that too is, right, I had to choose race because that was the one space that I didn't think we talked about enough. And it was just so relevant to my students because every time that we had a conversation, all students need to be taught well. All students need to be treated well. All students should deserve the best math possible. And yet, when my students were asked to do math, there was a different conversation about what my students meant versus what all students meant, right? There's a difference there. And I think we need to recognize that and point that out very specifically so we can get more and more in depth about the work that we do. And one of the ways that I've done it is by looking at the work of Robert Moses, who most of you, if you're familiar, one of my heroes in terms of this work, started out as a civil rights leader in the 60s and 70s and became a legend in the math community for having the students who lead this service do the most complex math possible, right? So we need that element of organization to be able to do the work that we do. For those of you who can't read from the back, by the way, so I'll read it because this is the only slide that's going to be like this, so I apologize. So algebra, once solely in place as the gatekeeper for higher math and the priesthood who gained access to it, now is the gatekeeper for citizenship. And people who don't have it are like the people who couldn't read and write in the industrial age. But because of how access to the learning of algebra was organized in the industrial era, in its place in society under its own jurisdiction, it has become not a barrier to college entrance, but a barrier to citizenship. So the work that we're doing right here doesn't just matter for kids to go to college and career and businesses and all that other nonsense that's being spouted out there. It's a big part of who we are and what we do as a society. It's going to be that key to getting kids to be full-on citizens, whether they're, in some of our reservations right around here, or they're even in some of our places that aren't as highlighted, in spaces not too far from here. We need to keep that in mind. The folks who are not only serviced by the big industrial corporations that make up our education entities. So here's some tips that I think might be helpful in moving this conversation forward. The thing that I know about math teachers is that we like showing our work. We are big about showing the work. And there's also a cultural saying for those of us who are critical race thinkers that it's called doing the work. So I'm going to marry now. So there's showing the work for math teachers, right? Doing the work for folks who are about critical race theory. And here's where we're going to converge a little bit on that. Math teachers ask critical questions, right? That's the whole point. We're not asking simple questions. We're trying to get deeper and deeper and deeper until we come to this understanding about what the math at hand is about. That's critical, number one. Number two, math teachers ask these questions of themselves and others. So, and how many of you are doing math in your spare time? How many of you just like doodle in your notebooks, just funny spirals? Shout out to Megan Smith, right? Those of you who are doing math in your spare time, I mean, that's what we do. And, for those of us who are invested in both the math conversation and the race conversation, we're having this outside of the spaces that we have confined to be whatever that topic is. So it's part of our life. It's part of our lifestyles. So that's a critical convergence there. Math teachers are also nimble enough where we have teachable moments. We're okay with that being teachable. We're okay with just stopping right there and saying, my lesson plan is not going to be good enough for your question, so I got to talk about what's going on here. And maybe ask you some questions, and then maybe I have something. And then the other part, too, is maybe we don't get closure at that moment either, right? Maybe we're not going to get closure right then and there. We're not going to have the answer, the solution right then and there. But we have a set of principles that says we can actually inquire more and come back to this later. These are things that a lot of us who work in that race space also do. We know there's not going to be a conclusion to racism tomorrow, right? But I think it's important for us to all work together to make that happen. Now, another part too is, which I hope all of us are invested in, is that there are multiple pathways for us to get that right answer, right? How many of y'all believe in that? Believe it or not, you think it's simple. No, it's been a progression in terms of math pedagogy to see that sort of expression being said. There are people who say, oh, if it's not correct, it is not correct. But there are those of us who say, no, I mean, it could be not correct. And then there are elements where it could be kind of correct, and then it just needs a few more things to tweak it. And I just need to ask the right questions. And then there's, oh wow, that was completely correct, and how did you do that? Can I ask you further about this set of problems that has to do with this, right? These are things that all of us have tools to use, and we can all use that at once. And so I ask you to just be complete about their work, to be correct about their work, and consistent at all times. So a lot of this is really about how do we have those conversations at any given moment, whether they be math or race. We can do both. I don't see why not. As a matter of fact, we can have the gender question. I mean, look how many women there are in the parliament, right? And people always say, oh, well, math is mainly a man-dominated thing, macho, yes. But women are doing it. And women are our teachers. So that's the feminism conversation needs to be in here too. So does the class conversation. So does the able-bodied conversation, which is sorely lacking. The LGBT conversation needs to happen too. But the same principles that we apply to math can be used to apply to the conversations that are way more difficult for us to have. And we often have to ask ourselves, why is it that we're able to have these conversations with students, but we can't ask that of ourselves? So we need to be uncomfortable with the process, right? We always ask our students, I need you to be uncomfortable. I need you to struggle with what we're about to do, because if there's the easy way, then that is no way at all. Then what happens when we leave them alone? What happens when learning math isn't about the destination where you're going to arrive at? It's not just a stop. It's like all the things that you did to get to that point. How about learning isn't linear? Sometimes it's usually a piecewise function, right? When you think about going from pre-K to K, oh, this is easy numbers, I got this. You start adding, yeah, it's easy. You start multiplying, okay, I think I got this. I think I can memorize them, at least I'll get away with it. And then you start dividing, it's like, how many of these can I divide? For a lot of our kids, that's the thought process they go through. And you think even through the progressions all the way through high school. None of this is linear, despite what the Common Core may say. Some of it is having to do with just learning through. Cheating off the smart kids in class is ephemeral at best. So you ever have a moment where you're like, oh, the kid thinks he knows the answer, and then you go test them a little further and they don't really know it, but then you realize who you sat them next to, and you're like, oh, I get it now. I mean, they can learn from that person, and that's great, but eventually they got to do it on their own. And we all have assessments for how to assess that, right? So these are the things that we do for our students. We should be able to do that for ourselves. And it's beyond P breaks. Beyond P breaks. Like, we ask for permission so often, right? And P breaks tends to be a thing for us because we have these block schedules that tells us when we're allowed to pee and when we're not. But when it comes to conversations like this, if you gotta go, you gotta go. And then when you gotta come back, you do that. Come back refreshed, though, because we need you in this, right? And so I'm going to ask you to take the lead. Really consider what it is to be a leader in this work. Get in there. Kick that door down. We need you. I mean, let's get energized. Let's really get focused. I know some of you are like, oh my gosh, Mr. How dare you make us think after lunch? How dare you? But I do have some good examples. I would love for you to follow them. I would love for you to consider Rafan's Davis. Who's familiar with her? Okay. Oh, gosh. See, this is why she has more followers than me. She is someone who has found her niche in talking not just about math, but then saying, how does this affect my kids? Specifically the ones in home, and then the ones in the school. And then it became, oh, we got to talk about all the kids. Because in fact, all the kids that you have in your class are actually my kids too, believe it or not. So, believe it or not, I'm also in your classrooms thinking about your kids, because your kids are my kids. And if I don't teach them well, and you don't teach them well, then we're all, I muted myself, yes. That's the issue for me. And so I think Rafran's does a very good job of enlightening so many of us who are afraid to have the conversation and say, here's a path for us to work through, and we can work through our children. Someone else who, believe it or not, I think is really fascinating is Max. Who's familiar with him? How cool are you? I think, see, and my son is louder than that, so that's not a big deal. What he's done is he's able to say, I'm going to steep myself all the way into this race conversation, and then whenever I want to step out and get back to math, I'll do that. If I got some of these books, I'll do that. But then I'm going to also have an uncomfortable conversation and try to pull all of us into this conversation around being difficult. So, and to his credit, by the way, I also want to mention Dan Meyer. But here's the thing I noticed about Dan Meyer. Whenever he tweets about math, he gets all the followers, he gets all the praise, the likes, the retweets, etc., and it's wonderful. But then when he tweets about social justice, where y'all at? Where are we at? And that's the question we need to have. But what I did find, the one thing that seemed to make everybody love him in the last, like, let's say month, but I can't go that far back, but I think his tweets are amazing. But one thing I will say is, there was one tweet that he did do that was the most popular in the last couple of weeks. And that's the one that math and race intersected. He highlighted one of his colleagues talking about race and math in a space that doesn't normally allow it. And ta-da, 69 retweets, 126 likes, which he doesn't normally average at all for any of these type of tweets, or even at all. I was fascinated. I was like, oh my gosh, like he's putting it out there and he does this. So here's something that I want us to think about when it comes to race, math, and our students. Our most disadvantaged students need access to higher order math. Unlike what Andrew Hacker and Nicholson Baker and all these other folk think, all these maths are going to be necessary for them in order to open as many doors as possible for our kids. I will tell you this much too. Our policies have to reflect that, so everybody gets the math that they need in order for them to have as many doors as they want open. They do not necessarily need to go to college, but if they do, then they already have the math background to be able to succeed wherever they go. I wish I had that in my back pocket, but for all the folks who were like me, there were folks who didn't get math at all in high school. The second piece, the math isn't necessarily adding up for our kids either. Some of our kids are getting suspended at ridiculous rates. They're not getting a sense of that their school loves them. They're reporting that, not just our black kids, our Native American kids, our Hispanic kids as well, our English language learners, our kids who are often labeled as special ed, right? These are kids that, should everything be equal, then we wouldn't see the disparity, but the numbers are just not adding up for them. And I think those of us who are teachers need to realize that, keep that in the front of our minds as we work through our work. Schools keep suspending the kids at disproportionate rates. Over-testing and this thing called rigor, right, ratchets it up, school closures and privatization. I think what we all mean by that is that sometimes we just want to teach math, and that's perfectly fine, but then we have to deal with the test. And then that test has more implications. It could, for many of us, how many of us have had a situation where our school may get shut down because of our low test score? Okay, so I see a couple hands in the back. I see one here. If you haven't been in that situation, then find people who have, because it is one of the most dire things you'll ever see, and sadly, it keeps us from being part of these conversations that are wonderful, because we also have to deal with what it's like to try to keep our school open at any given situation. And then, last piece that I want us to mention too is that when I do teach, I also keep in mind that first year of high school, because that first year of high school as a mathematician is probably the most critical. For so many of our kids, they think that they don't have to do well in math, they just have to get by. But then if in 8th grade, they're already learning the higher level math, then they already come in with a sense that they can achieve in 9th grade. And so in 9th grade, they're already like, oh my gosh, it's easy, I get a 90. And then they already have that leg up on so many of their other classmates who perhaps haven't had that mentality. And I think math also does contribute to a lot of the inequity that we see. And we need to keep that in mind as we go along. The last bit I do want to mention before, I'm going to have a whole half an hour to make y'all uncomfortable. The last bit I want to mention is, I mentioned earlier how my wife had a little bit of discomfort from me going here.
But the one thing I know is I also keep in mind the ideas of love, compassion, and empathy at the front of my mind, even when it's math. How many of you have heard that math is just sterile? How many of you have heard that math is sterile? Like it has nothing to do with the rest of the world, and there's no reason for us to bring in all these issues when we have to go teach quadratic functions. When in fact so many of our lives are variable. When in fact so many of the things that we know about our lives are non-proportional. So as we keep that in mind, I want to dedicate a small part of this presentation to something that happened a good 6 miles away from here. You'll also note that in that 6 miles, this man in back of me had memorized the food allergies and the food conditions of 500 students a clip. He kept that in mind. One of the folks who we wouldn't be part of this circle per se, but he loved and cared about the students. And so when I ask people to think about what can we do as math teachers, right? And the sort of principles that we can have when we approach. Yes, we are doing this because we want our kids to have numeracy, to be able to count, to estimate, to use tools in a very profound way, and then take that and solve problems that we don't have the answers to. And yet we have to do it because we don't necessarily see that the limit is going to be 0, but we keep going on because we just need to. This can't be life. And so to that end, I'm going to ask everyone to really consider how we can push the boundaries of what MTVOS can be and the force that is within this room, the people power, the